So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Best Day Ever Media. As always, I'm your host, Matt McKeever, joined by my co-host, Adam Martin. Adam, you finally made it up to the Citadel.
Finally made it up to the Citadel, guys. It's snowy and cold here, but it's nice to be off the road.
Nice. And if you guys want to see Mayday, Adam's dog, just going apeshit, you definitely need to be following him on Instagram. I definitely enjoyed the 1 a.m. just freak out of Mayday.
Yeah, literally leaping and bounding over the futon in single jumps, like clearing a whole couch, essentially. So my dog's a little bit crazy. She's already peed on Matt's putting green here, thinking it was grass, but I think we can move. I think we can forgive her because she's still a baby.
Yeah, and we'll see whether it becomes a pattern or not. Last time it was a pattern.
Yeah, I think so far the plan is to perhaps just banish her from the main lodge.
Yeah, or we can roll it up one way or the other. But anyways, we've got a full slate of news stories to explore with you guys today. I'm excited to jump into it. Before we do, though, I just want to do a quick little content share with you guys. So if you haven't checked out yet, the video I put together on the 14 Freedom Convoy lies that mainstream politicians, as well as the corporate press and legacy media shared, I really want to strongly encourage you guys to do so. I would really appreciate it. If you do watch it, smash the like button. Leave a comment. I don't really care about subscribers at this point in time, but sharing it on social media as well would be very helpful. I think we've got over 700 views already. Really hyped about that. I appreciate all the positivity and nice comments I've received in regards to it. My number one goal with this video is just to try and spread the truth. So I would love for more Canadians to see this. So if you guys don't mind sharing it in Telegram chats, share it in Discord, share it wherever you're normally interacting with your fellow Canucks, I would really appreciate it. And I think it's important right now as we see the Emergency Act inquiry and commission playing out that we make sure that it's not just the corporate press controlling the narrative at this point in time, because it really does feel that way. Like when I wade into the cesspool that is Reddit and I read what people are posting on Reddit about their takeaways from the emergency commission, it just like, it is unnerving to say the least, because they seem to think this is just so easily justifiable. And yet when I watch the same exact footage, it seems like we must live in parallel universes. But anyways, just want to share that with you guys. Anything on that, Adam, before we jump into the first stories of the day?
Oh, I'm actually just surprised to hear that Reddit was pro like mandate or pro emergency act. I wouldn't have actually suspected that. I would have thought it would be more of a libertarian crowd there, but I've also never used Reddit. So
I was going to say, tell me you don't use Reddit without telling me you don't use Reddit, because
okay.
I think anyone that's been around since, I don't know when it happened. Maybe it was like, was it 2012, guys? Was it 2015? Sometime around that era, I feel like Reddit completely shifted, and cancel culture, mob mentality, woke culture. Now, obviously, it's going to depend on your subreddits, but if you're in the big subreddits, like I forget, like Canada News, Canada Politics, things of that nature, I think it's very obvious which way the wind blows when it comes to their biases. But anyways, we've got lots to cover. I'm excited to jump into it. Let's start off with a few story updates, as we always do. Day 18 recap of Emergencies Act hearings sees us warn Trudeau of potential repercussions. Now, I think this is a much bigger story than people are making it out to be, for a multitude of reasons. One, because as I kind of hinted at earlier in the show, it seems like just about every justification to not be as solid a foundation as we were probably led to believe in February when it comes to the invocation for the first time ever in the history of Canada of the Emergencies Act But this kind of feels like it should be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I'm not positive that will be the case, but let's jump into it. So, the document states that CSIS officials attended 3 cabinet meetings prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, and that on February 13th, the day prior to invoking the act, CSIS told cabinet the implementation of the EA would likely galvanize the anti-government narratives within the convoy and further the radicalization of some towards violence. That seems 100% accurate from my personal perspective, my anecdotal evidence as boots on the ground supporter of the Freedom Convoy. That was like a line in the sand where it was one thing to demonize protesters, it was another to go after them with unprecedented government tyranny, in my opinion. And when you add on the layer that we've already seen the text message leaked, well, not leaked, it was presented at the commission, but when we've seen the text messages between Marco Mendocino's office staffers and the prime minister's office staffers, and that they didn't want to scare off the crazies from the Freedom Convoy, that to me already showed that they were hoping violence would actually occur. I truly believe they were hoping for a January 6th type of incident in Canada. I think they were doing everything they could to stoke those flames, short of just like handing out guns and getting people drunk to try and get them to riot. But this is important to understand that CSIS was like, hey, this might actually like be a net negative invoking the Emergencies Act. The document also states that in the that same February 13th meeting with cabinet, CSIS advised the government that although invoking the EA would likely lead to the dispersing of the Ottawa protests, the invocation would push Canadians to believe that violence is the only solution to what they perceive as a broken system in government. Yeah, that actually seems quite logical to me. If you're not allowed to protest, what other options are available to the average person, right? Adam?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's also I think the timing of this should be considered as well, right? Like, this is also coming off of a year of isolation and coming out of not being able to go to work and not see your family and, perhaps not even attend the funeral of your loved ones that, passed away, right? Like, the timing and the level of tension building up here, like, this is a powder keg, right? So, it's not even just like you can't protest, but it's like you can't protest after a year of isolation, right?
Well, and to be fair, like we're actually talking almost 2 years, right? Because it was March 2020 until February, essentially 2022, is when the protest really hit its full stride here in Canada. So yeah, to think that it took 2 years, you weren't allowed to travel on airplanes or trains or ferries at that moment in time as well. Um, like even if someone is very pro mandate, and first of all, I'm sorry for your brain damage, but even if you were pro mandate, like you have to understand where the Freedom Convoy was coming from. Like, if you literally cannot even interpret why they thought this was government overreach, if you can't even understand how we had slid further and further down that slippery slope of tyranny, honestly, it feels like you're willfully blind to this, right? Like you're purposely being ignorant to the facts on the ground. Particularly, even at this moment in time, when we see the Canadian government and health officials trying to position us potentially for more lockdowns, more mask mandates here in Canada, while the United States is talking about amnesty, right, and just trying to sweep all the previous mistakes, let's say, when it comes to policies around the COVID pandemic under the rug. Here in Canada, we're like, no, we should do more of this almost. Anyways, to get back on track here, it is shocking to see this because I actually like honest personal bias here. I would have thought CSIS would have been back in this shit for the most part. It's been interesting to see how everyone's tried to remove themselves from this, right? Like we've seen the Ottawa mayor, the Windsor mayor say they didn't ask for this. We've seen Doug Ford not wanting to testify in front of the commission either. We've seen the Ottawa police, the RCMP, and CSIS. None of them appear to have directly called for it. So this honestly kind of feels like it was a creation, a concoction of the Liberal cabinet or Justin Trudeau and his inner circle. And again, when you see their communications between their staffers, it's hard to not at least be suspect of how this all played out in real time. And at the same time, one thing that kind of gets overlooked here is literally the round of standing ovation that the protesters deserve. Because at no point did it get violent, right? Like, it's hard for me to believe that this wouldn't have became violent if it was in the United States. Whether you want to look on the left or the right side of the aisle, look at the Black Lives Matter protest, look at the January 6th incident. Like, there's almost no doubt in my mind that had this played out in America, we'd have had much different results, right? And the lives would have been lost. There's no doubt in my mind about that. So one, I think the average Canadian citizen again needs to remember like how proud we should be that like even under those sort of crazy circumstances, right? Under unprecedented experiences that we were able to keep cool heads there and we were able to avoid violence. At the same time, the fact that our government chose to try and instigate, like, I honestly don't know how else to frame it. It honestly feels like they were daring protesters to lash out. Adam?
Yeah, I think this is like literally the most Canadian thing that's ever happened. It was so peaceful. Nothing went to hell. And like I guess like their only thing too that they want to reference is like the inherent violence of a swastika. And you're like, "Oh, what?" So like you did this crazy ass lockdown and invoked these crazy rules that have never been invoked before in the history of the country because there was inherent violence of a symbol. And you
And and
that's
like
crazy.
I honestly think it's disingenuous if you're claiming outside of maybe one protester, right? Who knows the
Yeah.
dude that was in like black bloc with the actual Nazi flag? For all I know, he could be the worst anti-Semitic in all of Canadian history. No idea who that dude is, so it's hard to ascribe like motive behind it, right? Or what his intentions were. But outside of that, to try and claim that the swastikas were anything but a commentary on the Canadian government's actions
Yes.
during the pandemic is disingenuous at best and outright lying, I think, in most cases when it comes to how the corporate press chose to frame that narrative. But one thing I highlighted back in the day on the Maple Pill was like, look at any pro-Palestine protest in Canada. And it doesn't have to be the biggest one in the world. Like we see it in London, Ontario, whenever there's pro-Palestinian protesters, right? Or anti-Israel or anti-apartheid protests. They always will have swastikas. There will be Nazi flags, right? And we never see the same sort of condemnation of those protesters. And yet, understand that's actually directed directly at Jewish people in the Jewish state. I would argue that that's a difference in kind versus a difference in degree when looking at what played out here at the Freedom Convoy protest. So, continuing on from the article here, despite this, Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino accused protesters at a February 16th press conference of committing acts of violence. Mendicino even went as far as to accuse the protesters of threats of rape toward Ottawa residents before having to walk back his accusation after not being able to present supporting evidence. And this is a recurring narrative that drives me crazy here, is how comfortable members of parliament as well as the corporate press are willing to say, like, there was threats of violence. Masks were being ripped off. People were being threatened with rape, and yet there's no evidence whatsoever. Charges dropped during that period in time, and any sort of like argument that's made for it, honestly, again, it feels disingenuous to me when they're like, "Well, police didn't feel safe making those charges." No, like, are you telling me if there was legit acts of violence, if there was legit threats of rape, the police wouldn't have stepped in? That individuals wouldn't have turned to the police for like justice? It's very hard for me to take that at face value. And yet, understand that's how the corporate media and the politicians, particularly in the Liberal and NDP parties, always frame this discussion, right? And again, in that video I put together, it's an hour and 6 minutes, guys. I know that that's a decent amount of time in your life, but it's worth it just to make sure you've got the right talking points and you can push back, over whatever the next family interaction when people are like, because who knows how this inquiries or like this commission's actually going to play out. But like the truth matters. And we should try and hold that as a standard that we want to push forward at all times.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's the bare minimum, right? Can we just have the facts? Like that's all we're really looking for here.
Yeah, it honestly doesn't feel like it should be too much, and yet, here we are. These are unique times for sure in Canada and just the world in general. Continuing on, meanwhile, a federal judge in Toronto ruled that Ontario Premier Doug Ford shouldn't be forced to testify at the hearings in front of Commissioner Paul Rouleau in Toronto. Judge Simon Fothergill reasoned that Ford and Deputy Premier Sylvia Jones are granted immunity from taking the stand due to parliamentary privilege. Now, I I just kind of want to highlight this one because I don't like this from Doug Ford whatsoever. I'm not a Doug Ford fan in the first place, but I think that this hiding behind parliamentary privilege is used far too often in politics, whether at the federal or provincial level. And it has nothing to do with trying to protect the average citizen. This is all about politicians trying to cover their own ass, right? Whether it's trying to save face with their base, whether it's trying to cover up or obfuscate poor decisions they made, time and time again, whenever I see parliamentary privilege invoked, it's always from, again, in my opinion, disingenuous actors. Maybe that's going to be my word of the day here.
Look, if you're doing shit so nefarious that you can't say it out loud in public, like I think that's all we needed to know, that like you should be called in front of the public, right? Like just tell us what you're doing. If it's so bad that it can't stand up to criticism, then I think we should reevaluate those actions themselves, right? Like this is the very basis of truth and transparency. It's like you have to take ownership, right? You have to have accountability. And these little devices or tools that these guys have to hide from us is so, it just doesn't feel like what you would have in a proper democratic state, right? Like it's just, why are you hiding?
Yeah, it always feels like it's plain semantics, right? We like in grade, I forget, grade 7, we had this teacher, and like he was such a stickler for grammar and proper word usage that if you're like, you know, uh, can I go to the bathroom? He'd be like, I don't know, can you? And
Yeah.
that
May
feels like
I?
every
Shut the
politician.
fuck
And you're
up.
like, may I go to the bathroom? He's like, yes, you may. And you're just like, "Uh, this isn't teaching me proper grammar. This is just teaching me to hate people that care about proper
Yeah,
grammar
this
and
is
word
why you're
usage."
getting 39,000 a year. Fuck off.
But anyways, let's keep rolling because there's a couple more stories that are adjacent to the Freedom Convoy that are going to boil my blood even further. So let's get into this next one. This one's a doozy, in my opinion. Ottawa police officer ordered to forfeit 40 hours pay for donating to Freedom Convoy. Now, you'd be
Wow.
thinking, a reasonable person must be thinking like, okay, this must have been after the Emergencies Act came out, right? Like they must have donated a huge sum of money, stood on a pulpit and tried to embarrass the government, embarrass police. No, it's the exact opposite of what you think. So according to the agreed statement of facts, Nielsen donated $55 through GoFundMe on January 23rd. January 23rd. The Emergencies Act wasn't invoked until February 14th. So we're literally talking
Wow.
about like 1 or 2 days into the convoy. This person donated $55. To the best of my knowledge, they didn't make this like a big publicity stunt. And to forfeit 40 hours of pay, like again, like that seems bizarre to me at the minimum. Like you have to work for 40 hours free because you donate $55 to a political movement to protesters that we don't like.
Yeah, that seems
Like it's
that
gross.
seems corrupt, man. That's bad.
Like, I honestly like, I was thinking about this, and I know that I'm just cut from different cloth than most people, but I couldn't work for an organization if
No,
that was the enforcement. And like, again, I get it. If you read on in the details, like his I forget whether it's an actual lawyer or not, but essentially like the plaintiff, like the defendant here, they agreed to this. So again, like that means that initially there must have been something worse on the
like worse.
table.
Yeah.
And
So
so
like
like
he took this and this is the deal that
this
he
is like
got
the
cut.
plea bargain. Yeah.
Oh,
This is like, stand in front of the class, admit you're wrong, and we'll show leniency when it comes to punishing you. Like it's bizarre to like you can just make someone work for free. Like it's just so
yeah.
weird.
Who is that protecting and serving? I would love to know.
Yeah, it's just like it's so fucking gross, especially considering the context. It'd be one thing if it was after the Emergencies Act being invoked. I still wouldn't be okay with it, but at least I could comprehend the mental framework that came to that conclusion. Based upon my understanding of the facts here, like this is just beyond the pale. Now, this person, they've worked in the police service for 12 years, had no other blemishes on their record.
Wow.
Like I would be done with it. I get there's probably a pension at play and benefits here,
Yeah.
and like that's probably why they bowed down. But understand it's this sort of like you know, the left constantly talks about power dynamics. This to me is a massive power dynamic where you've got the entire weight of the state going against an individual participant. And what at the time was completely lawful, right? Like this wasn't outlawed at any moment in time, and it shouldn't be outlawed. The idea of donating to a protest or a political movement that you agree with.
Yeah, I have no clue how they could possibly enforce that or how you would be okay taking that deal. I feel like I would die on the hill and force them to fire me and then take severance.
Yeah. like that's definitely, again, I imagine they could just be like, nope, we're not severancing you. And like the one thing is like, you know, as much as I hate unions, this is when I'd
Yeah.
expect a bat
I
for you, right?
I was
Like,
literally just thinking that, like, where's the union in this? I guess smoking
because like
mirrors
they
distracted with
do have a
puking.
powerful union, so it's just fascinating to me that like this wasn't worth saving people for. But anyways, let's talk about another story that I guess this is good news. This one's from Blacklock Reporters. Facebook post was no crime. So Facebook messages of support for the Freedom Convoy don't justify a conviction for mischief, the Ontario Court of Justice has ruled. So hey, it means I won't be getting
Thank
that,
you.
and everyone else that talked about or supported the Freedom Convoy on social media, hopefully we won't be in charge by our government.
Dude, can you imagine if that was not the ruling? Can you imagine if they were actually gonna go on a witch hunt after this? Like, what would that mean for the country? What would that mean for
Yeah,
our state of the union, man? I would literally lose my shit. I'd be on the first plane out.
yeah. Well, first thing they would do is shut down travel again, Adam, so that you
True.
couldn't. But yeah, absolutely agree. Like, yeah, it's bizarre, to say the least. Let's keep rolling here, though, because we've got lots to cover. This one from Zero Hedge: Ukraine openly rejects reported White House pressure to negotiate. Now, before even getting into this, based upon my understanding of things, I honestly feel like the US is kind of like the your partner or the girlfriend that eggs you on into a fight. Where like just and like but then changes their mind immediately as well. Because like if you guys remember originally, we heard rumors that the US was like to the Ukraine, like, do not negotiate whatsoever. And that was like right as the conflict started. Now the US is like, no, let's negotiate. And it's just like this flip while also still sending billions of dollars in support. Like, this is just so weird and bizarre.
I feel like they got their claws sunk in. So they have financial obligations now. Ukraine does, right? Like they'll have financial debts now to the US.
Yeah.
They're using their equipment. They've sort of had their standoff. The US has got their claws dug in, and now they're like, okay, we should probably like roll this back though, right? Because you guys know that you can't beat Russia. Like they'll just steamroll you. And you know, you've been having some favorable conditions with the weather and all their tanks and armor getting, you know, bogged down and shit, but that's going to change soon. So it's like, yeah, maybe we should roll this back and avoid nuclear holocaust. But by the way, you still owe us billions of dollars, even
Yeah.
if not directly, in favors for sure.
Yeah, so getting into the article here, Ukraine leadership has responded to a weakened Washington Post report, which said the White House has been privately urging the Ukrainian government to show openness towards negotiations with Russia. The report called these efforts part of a calculated attempt to ensure the government in Kiev maintains the support of other nations, facing constituencies wary of fueling a war for many years to come. It also cited Ukraine fatigue among the Western voting public. I wonder why the Western voting public is Ukraine fatigued when their government shows no interest or inclination to care about their local events, right? Like when you've got the German politician saying, like, I don't care if Germans don't care about Ukraine. We're going to fight this war anyways. We're going to fund this war anyways.
Dude, they literally said, I don't care if our people want to stand down from this. We're not doing it. We're not negotiating with them. They can freeze. You're like, okay, sure. That's why. And so now we've got wood, chopped wood at an all-time high level of demand and probably a lack of supply, right? It's just like
Hmm.
unbelievable, you guys.
Yeah. Last point here. In response, an advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reaffirmed the long-stand stance that negotiations remain impossible so long as Vladimir Putin is president. So essentially, they said that they'll only negotiate. Like,
Okay,
long story short, the TLDR here is like, we'll negotiate with the next president of Russia. And you're like,
great.
oh, well, Putin seems like a very reasonable man. So I'm sure he'll just step aside and step down and we can all move forward. Oh, and Russia will definitely give back Crimea, right? Like there'll be no issues there either. Like this just seems so naive, I guess. Honestly, like this is all just to the detriment of your average Ukrainian and Russian citizen. Like how many more tens of thousands of lives are going to be lost in this conflict? And I think that we're going to kind of end up with a status quo where no one's happy, but a lot of lives have been lost and billions of dollars have been wasted.
Hey, careful. That tweet almost got Elon canceled.
Yeah, absolutely. And
But, yeah,
probably cost him.
I'm not getting stepping down vibes from, Mr. Putin. I'm pretty sure Mr. Putin's dug in right now. I'm pretty sure he's not going anywhere.
Yeah, I would suspect that that's accurate. Continuing on, another story update here. ABC News says Red Mirage will look like Republican win, but vote could take weeks. And so there's a lot to unpack here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Obviously, we've got midterm elections going on today. The corporate press has been prepping us for an extended period of time now that it'll take a longer period than normal in order to figure out who actually won. Now, obviously, when we talk about governments in Africa or South America, if they're not able to settle up and figure out who won within a couple days, that's usually a sign of shenanigans when it comes to their election. But in America, that's actually a sign that your election's completely free and fair. So good news there, because the way I know that is because the corporate media has been telling me that nonstop. Even though we've also got Biden coming out saying that we'll have election deniers, but people have to trust the election, when all the polls seem to show this drastic shift towards Republicans. But it just it's hard to not be a conspiracy theorist right now at this moment in time. We'll see how these elections play out. But anyways, the legacy news outlets have published an article titled "Every Election Night Results Might Not Indicate Final Tallies." Or sorry, early election night results might not indicate final tallies, and why that's okay. The piece explains how Republicans may appear to be leading their Democratic opponents, even by large margins, in federal and statewide races, but that their leads will dwindle or crumble completely after dumps of mail in and absentee ballots are counted after Election Day, which could take weeks. Now, obviously, there's already been some edge case stories coming out about how I think in Arizona, certain polling stations don't seem to have their voting machines working and weird things like that. In Detroit, we've also got some weird shenanigan stories coming out. We saw Hillary Clinton saying that, Republicans will try and steal this election. Obviously, you're not allowed to say someone's stealing the election unless they're Republican, because, Stacey Abrams is allowed to get away with that and all sorts of things. One last point here, and then we'll jump over to your thoughts here, Adam. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre also said yesterday that the vote count may take days to be sorted out, asserting that's how this is supposed to work, despite no such narrative being in place when Democrats performed well in the 2018 midterm elections. So again, it's just interesting how quickly our democracies can evolve here in the West. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just feel like they pay no mind to the gravity of their statements. Like when Hillary Clinton, who, whether you like her or not, she's very politically influential. When she's up there saying that it could be a stolen election, like that those are fighting words, right? Like, is this a legitimate democracy, or I guess a constitutional republic, whatever we want to call the damn thing? Can we trust these votes or not? Because if we can't trust it, like something's very, very, very broken. And I think that just for her to just be able to say that, like that's completely undermining the legitimacy of the government there. And that's so brutal because, like, whenever, and not that I'm pro Trump or anything, but like whenever Trump said stuff like this, he was absolutely torched online by the entire international community. Right. So it's just really crazy. This whole like rules for thee, but not for me approach to politics that we're seeing lately.
Yeah, agree with that. And I think one thing to keep in mind here when we talk about elections in general, again, we had stories coming out just recently here yesterday, right, in Canada about Chinese interference and how they're the biggest interference network when it comes to Canadian elections. There's two things when it comes to elections. One is whether the elections are actually fair, and the other is whether people believe and trust in the
Yeah.
institution and believe it was fair. They're actually two very separate situations, but both are actually critical in order to actually have a well-functioning democracy or a well-functioning constitutional republic. And uh, no matter what, regardless of how this vote plays out, if either or both sides walk away and decide that this was, again, not a fair election, that shenanigans occur, like that's only going to polarize both sides further. We're going to see individuals radicalized. And I think the 2024 elections are shaping up to be a very, uh, like, yeah, I think that we'll see something crazy happen in 2024. I don't know how else to really say that. Uh, But let's keep rolling here. Jumping over one other point on U.S. elections that I think Canadians should keep in mind. This is from the Western Standard. U.S. midterms could mean dark future for Trudeau and Liberals. So it would be interesting if we saw a wave of mega Republicans. I don't think that they've got any love for Justin Trudeau and a lot of his policies and perspectives. And I think one of the few things that allowed Trudeau over the last year and a half, essentially, since Joe Biden came into power, to continue to double down on his policies around COVID-19 and the fear mongering and just the hysteria they created was the fact that the Biden administration wasn't going to call him out on it, right?
Yeah.
Was the fact that they weren't going to push back hard. In fact, they were more than happy to often walk lock and step with the same sort of policies. Whereas if we see the House and the Senate go red, it's going to be a lot more difficult, I think, for Trudeau to continue on status quo. And I think that that's a net positive here in Canada as well.
Yeah, I really agree with that, Matt. And like just with them being so like obviously the proximity, right? Like there's such huge trade partners with us. And I just feel like if America's like, hey, we're shutting all this shit down, we're getting back to business, we're damaged right now and we need to build back. I really do believe that they'll put a lot of pressure on Canada to play ball with that. And it's just unfortunate that we had, weekend at Bernie's with both our prime minister and their president for the last little while, where they can both just be, dead in the water, just little puppets to whatever's going on here. So I'm very excited to see this happen. And however long it takes them to count up these votes, I'm definitely looking forward for the results.
Yeah, and for people interested, I guess I'll maybe jump in here with a little content recommendation. I believe both Tim Pool as well as Louder with Crowder are doing special episodes tonight, kind of tracking it. I'll probably be watching one or kind of jumping between both. And this is kind of like sports for me almost, right?
Can
Like,
we restream it through here? Can we restream us doing a watch party of this thing onto Rumble or something?
yeah, we could definitely do it on Rumble, and probably you'd be okay on YouTube. But yeah, definitely Rumble would have no qualms about that. So yeah, maybe we'll do that, Adam.
That'd
That'd
be
be kind
cool.
of
I'd
fun.
be really down for that.
And
So
we
if you
could
guys
hop
want to,
between both their feeds and also
yep,
just like the mainstream feed. Yeah, let's
yep,
tentatively we'll do that. But
cool.
let's keep rolling here. My WTF story for the day is just a weird one. And actually, I meant to stay up to watch this and I didn't. So I'm curious. I know you got in late, Adam, but Blood Moon to appear on election night for the first time in history. And so obviously, people that are prone to conspiracies, to reading tea leaves and things like that, they're citing this as a historical event that signifies a cultural and political shift. Now, when you look at the odds of literally a blood moon on like an election night, my understanding is it's like astronomical odds, and
Man,
obviously it's the first time ever. But did you see the blood moon last night?
I didn't, but do you know how bad you need to fuck up for the moon to go red? Like even the moon's like, nah, we're out of here with these Democrats. We're going Republican.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't even think about the symbolism of it actually turning red. I was more like focused. And what's weird is they call it beaver blood here in Canada.
Yeah,
I read the headline.
what I've read that this morning too, and I was like, what in the hell? I've never heard that term before. But I was a little bit sad when I saw all of these posts because I just wasn't really paying attention. Maybe I drove by it, the damn thing, but I didn't see it.
Yeah. Anyway, I just found it interesting to say the least. But if you guys are interested, I'll link this story as well as all the other articles that we're sharing with you today in the Telegram chat. I forgot to share it before the show, but I will absolutely do that after the show. But let's get into the first main story of the day I want to explore with you guys. Today's inflation surge should discredit modern monetary theory forever. So MMT, you know, it was really weird over these last 2 years. I would post on my like larger Instagram account, the real estate like oriented account, about inflation, my concerns about printing press goes burr, quantitative easing, and all that. And I would get these like pompous, self-righteous individuals jumping in and be like, "Well, clearly you don't understand modern monetary theory," and like obviously, the inner Austrian economist in me would just like froth at the mouth at both the condescension as well as like the fact that I know that these like poli sci majors heard this term once and never looked deep into it. And they're just like, deficits don't matter when the government can issue currency. And you're like, no, I think I'm prone to actually lean on the side of history that shows, every fiat currency eventually goes to zero. Quick, Adam, something here?
Yeah. No, it's just brilliant. Like, yeah, we can debase this shit. We don't need to actually have anything to peg it to. We can just do all the QE we want and just get away with it. You're like, what are you talking about? Like, who does this make sense to?
Well, and then and we'll explore it a little bit further in the article here. And this article is worth reading cover to cover, guys, in my opinion. But like one of their like clapbacks then when you're like, whoa, printing press go burr, bad thing, and like you can have too much liquidity in the market, and they'd be like, well, then we'll just increase taxes because that's what MMT says. Is like
Classic.
that's how you balance things out. Is like we don't even have to necessarily pull back in the stimulus. The more money out in the economy is a good thing. And then if we want to take it back, again, we'll just tax you more, and that's how we'll balance things. And it's like, so you're like, government intervention created a problem. Let's government intervene more. And then, like, if that intervention goes wrong, we'll intervene more on the other side. And just like, it's just wild, in my opinion.
Well, and this is how you get businesses leaving your country, right? This is how you get businesses moving. This is how you lose production inside your country. And then they'll do some crazy ass shit like fix the price or do just like controlling trade, like our dairy board. You're just like, what? Like, I literally don't understand how you guys haven't figured this out yet. It doesn't work. It's
Yeah.
just wild.
Agree. So let's get into this article here. We'll explore I'll try and give a little synopsis here of MMT and then highlight the main points that Connor makes in his article. It's been a rough year for advocates of modern monetary theory, MMT. After nearly 2 years with all the budget deficits and money printing, MMTers could have wanted. The doctrine's popularity seems to have faded now that we've passed the honeymoon phase. 2022 has clearly demonstrated that creating a lot of new money and running massive government deficits does, in fact, come at a cost. We should let the theory die before it causes any more destruction. According to MMT, having concerns about the national debt is antiquated and childish. And again, that's literally like the approach that I got from these MMTers in my DMs, and it would just drive me fucking crazy. In fact, they argue that the total national debt is nothing more than a record of how many dollars there are in the pockets of private citizens. A higher national debt is not the consequence of MMT, it's the entire point. The pandemic was, in many ways, MMT's moment. So just as MMT sees the national debt as a measurement of all the dollars the government created and put into people's pocket, taxes are the tools for the government to take money back out of the economy if inflation gets too high. Setting aside how economically flawed this characterization is, a government following the MMT playbook will run into a political problem at this point in the cycle. It is relatively easy to convince politicians and everyday people that the government programs they dream about can be funded by creating new money. And the true cost of this method, currency devaluation, is not felt or seen immediately. That adds to the illusion that something can be had for nothing, but taxes are the opposite. Everyone can see the line on their receipt, the amount withheld on payday, and the check they have to send to the IRS each April. The economic pain is felt without any clear immediate benefit. And so, to build an analogy here, it's similar to someone that's maybe eating like an all sugar diet. Are you going to get diabetes the first day? No. Can you maybe skate by the first month? Yeah, probably. Decades of that shit will catch up to you, right? And again, it's humans often looking for the shortest feedback loop possible that I think allows us to be captured by these fallacies. Further on, or I guess to summarize the article here, this year has demonstrated that printing vast quantities of money is costly and that the political will to even stick with MMT breaks down when the going gets tough. That should be enough to completely discredit this ridiculous theory. And I hope if nothing else, we'll at least have to wait till the next, printing press goes burr cycle when I'm bitching about it before I get more stupid DMs about MMT.
Yeah. Yeah. It's literally mind numbing to listen to these people. Great content recommendation, by the way. If you guys haven't already read the Fiat Standard, it's an easily digestible format to get some history on some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I see Chicken Little's asking about the Red Moon. I believe it was supposed to be last night. Maybe I misread the articles, but I believe it was like at 3 a.m. PST on November 8th is when it was expected to like hit its pinnacle, the eclipse. So just again, you guys can fact check me on that, but I believe that that's the case. Jumping over to fee stories now, the problem with declaring a pandemic amnesty. I hope you guys aren't sick of this topic. And the reason I hope you're not sick of it is because I think this is actually really important. And the lessons we learn through trying to navigate these waters of like, do you forgive and forget? Is there amnesty? Do we need Nuremberg 2.0 trials? Is any severe overstep by government or the mob rule or whatever happens next, I think we'll constantly need to refer back to this lesson, because I think we're going to see more divisive moments in our near future. And in order to navigate those waters, I think we need a real framework and not to be captured by emotions. I understand, and it's fun, some of the memes I see out there, right? They're just like, whatever, blue hairs screaming for amnesty and just a Chad being like, no. But I think we actually need a much more nuanced conversation around this. So this article from Fee Stories, the problem with declaring a pandemic amnesty. The issue with the Atlantic's amnesty proposal is that it assumes forgiveness can and should happen even in the absence of justice or accountability. And I felt like this article took a unique angle versus some of the ones we've covered previously. So let's highlight here what they're really trying to get at. This may seem like a reasonable argument at first glance. It is true that there was a lot we did not know at the start of the pandemic. It is also true that solely dwelling on the past can prevent people from moving forward in a productive way. At the same time, upon closer examination, the core of Oster's argument is deeply flawed because, one, it does not reckon with the real injustices done to millions of people during the pandemic as a result of arrogant policymaking, and two, it fundamentally misunderstands the nature and role of forgiveness in society. So, when looking at the consequences of lacking humility, the first issue with Oster's argument is that it does not properly consider the injustices done to millions of people during the pandemic, primarily as a consequence of policy that was profoundly lacking in humility. In the first time period, when we did not have adequate information to know what was best, interventionist policymakers nevertheless acted as if they did know. They fell into a trap that Nobel Prize winning economist F.A. Hayek called the pretense of knowledge, namely, the idea that anyone could know enough to engineer society successfully. I think this is a really important point here, because I do think we need to differentiate between politicians, health officials, policymakers, people in power, and the average person that watched 30 minutes of news a week and just assumed they were being told the truth. Further on in the article, then in the second time period, when we did have adequate knowledge to make well informed policy choices, policymakers did not follow the evidence, instead, opting to follow ideology and cave to social pressure. And part of that, in my opinion, is they honestly amped up the mob to be so fearful for such an extended period of time that by the time new information came out, they couldn't look weak, or they couldn't figure out how to pivot and save face. And so instead, they decided simply to double down on their perspective. So finally, Oster's article seems to conflate mistakes made in the absence of evidence by private individuals and mistakes made due to arrogance by public authorities. But those two things are not at all the same. The anger that most people feel is towards the latter, yet from the beginning of the piece, Oster fails to make this distinction. But it's precisely this distinction that illuminates why people feel like we cannot move on, namely because policymakers assume that they know best, forced their vision onto the entire country, and then never took responsibility when their policies harmed countless people. In a commentary on the story of Noah, the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs points out that the first moral principle set out in the Torah is that of justice. God says, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made man." However, Rabbi Sachs points out that this principle on its own would draw people into a potentially endless and destructive cycle of retaliation, which is bad for both sides. From this, we can derive the world is built on the dual moral imperatives of justice and forgiveness. Rabbi Sachs writes that without these, no group can survive in the long run. He is correct. Without forgiveness, we would be stuck in a cycle of bitter attacks against one another. But without accountability or justice, the injustices that took place are, one, bound to happen again, and two, less likely to be forgiven or forgotten by the victims. And I think that that's actually a very nuanced explanation there that I haven't seen a lot of other people saying no to amnesty make in their arguments. And that was one of the main reasons I wanted to share this article with you guys. This is all to suggest that it seems as though justice and accountability are actually prerequisites to forgiveness. And I do think that once someone's admitted their mistake, it is a lot easier to forgive. That's obviously my anecdotal experience, but I think it's really worth pointing out. And finally, here, as always, the proper approach contains a balancing act. The issue is that currently too many people have taken extreme positions that neglect one of the two moral principles discussed above: justice and forgiveness. However, the greater number of people that recognize justice and forgiveness are not mutually exclusive, but rather perfect companions, the closer we will get to being able to move forward as a unified country in order to address the myriad problems we still face. So I feel like that really well sums up my evolving thoughts on this. I don't know if you've got anything, Adam.
Uh, I would just give another content recommendation there. You brought up Hayek, and if anybody hasn't yet read The Road to Serfdom, I think that's a great book as well that just kind of talks about socialism and why some of these issues can compound and lead to very slippery slopes by removing personal freedoms. And I think even just understanding how these things can evolve is a great place to start. Like if we want to have the amnesty discussion, it's like, okay, I'll give you amnesty if first we get some accountability, some ownership, and you guys have to go and read this book so that you understand why this was so offensive, right? Why this was so dangerous and why this could have escalated to a very bad and dark place, like we saw, we've seen it countless times historically. So if you guys haven't yet read The Road to Serfdom, I would highly recommend that book.
Yeah, and I think that it's important for those of us that don't want to just see like forgive and forget without admission of guilt or admission of mistakes. We need to frame our arguments, I think, in this nuanced language to really explain our ultimate goal here is not to punish you, but it's to make sure that this can never happen again. And the only way this can never happen again is if you admit your hubris, right? To the policymakers, to the health officials, to the politicians, to the pharmaceutical companies. They need to admit the hubris that they assumed that even in the absence of perfect information, that they absolutely knew best and it was their way or the highway at all times. All right. Let's jump into the third story of the day. This is something that we've kind of chatted about briefly, but never sunk our teeth into. And I felt like this article was the perfect opportunity here. Toronto Sun, another 171 overdose deaths in BC for September from toxic drug supply, coroner. Illicit drug toxicity is the leading cause of unnatural death in BC and second only to cancers for years of life lost. And so, what's important here to understand, people may point to COVID causing more deaths or COVID plus comorbidities causing more deaths, but those are usually going to be in individuals that weren't going to live for a lot longer, right? They're usually a lot older, people that already had compromised immune systems, things of that nature. Now, that doesn't mean that their life isn't worth living, but I do think that there's value in us at least understanding the concept of life lost, right? Years of life lost here. And 171 overdoses, maybe at first doesn't sound crazy in a month, but like, I don't know, there was something about this next fact that like really sunk home. Nearly 6 people a day are dying of overdoses in British Columbia. And if there was to be 6 shooting deaths a day in any province in Canada, I can only imagine what the government would try and do to stop those deaths from occurring, right?
They would go
Like,
ballistic, literally.
right? Like, literally, you would have like door to door searches and gun confiscations, in my opinion. However, when it comes to these drugs, they're coming through our ports, right? It seems like the government, they're not completely blind to it, but they don't seem to actually be focused on getting to the root of the problem, right? And again, that has to do with money laundering, Chinese triad, like drug cartels. There's a lot to unpack there. And I'm not saying that there's one policy prescription that will fix everything. But first of all, we need to truly admit this, right? When's the last time we heard a federal politician talk about this whatsoever, right? Justin Trudeau was more than happy to demonize all sorts of Canadians for daring to protest. And yet, we might get like a little soundbite about how unfortunate the fentanyl crisis is, but we never actually really see people trying to solve this. And for Jagmeet Singh, right? He's from BC, if I'm not mistaken. Why is this not one of his top talking points regularly about we need to figure this out? And again, simply having halfway houses and a few of the band-aid solutions that we regularly see put on this, that's not even it's not even fixing the symptoms, let alone the underlying cause here.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the issues here too is that to properly address this type of thing, they would have to properly address the prohibition on these drugs, right? Like the actual solution here is probably legalizing these things and creating safe and just credible producers, right? Like you would have this be regulated by some sort of quality control board, right? And put it out to the public so that if they're going to do it, they're going to do it anyways. They might as well consume it safely.
Well,
So
yeah, and again, I'm not going to claim to be a drug expert here, but I'm pretty sure the majority of these fentanyl overdoses, people weren't like, "I want fentanyl." They were actually trying
no,
to get other drugs that happen to be laced with fentanyl, right? So again, that's a big aspect of this. And the other thing about the idea of either legalization or extreme decriminalization and allowing production of this by parties or corporations that are monitored is that you can't then immediately like jack taxes to the point where it's still going to be economically more viable for people to seek solutions on the black market versus seeking solutions on the white market. Um, but yeah, again, the idea that we're on pace for over 2,000 deaths this year in BC alone due to essentially
it's
fentanyl
crazy.
overdoses is wild. The coroner says at least 10,505 British Columbians have died since the public health emergency into overdose deaths was declared in April 2016. So, again, when we look at this from the years of life lost, this is a tragedy that's only second place to cancer. Like, that's
Yeah,
fucking wild.
that's legitimately wild, right?
Yeah. I don't really have too much else to say for that, but just wanted to highlight this article, guys. Again, we'll link it in the Telegram chat if you want to check it out. Let's jump over to our last story of the day. This one from the Brownstone Institute. They want us to hate each other. So I'm not going to cover the historical context of this essay, but obviously, just to give you quick background context here, they're discussing Rwanda, right, in 1972, and how sides were made to hate each other. But let's kind of leave the historical context for now and more just focus on the core concepts here. Polarization is power. So human beings are tribal by nature. We instinctively divide the world into an us and a them. It's a mental shortcut. It relieves us of any responsibility to engage in deeper discernment. It protects us from risk. If we just stick with our own people, or so the argument goes, then we will be safe. We become characters, enemies, cockroaches, right? So again, when you create these us versus them in and out groups, and it's so hard for me to not want to draw parallels to what Justin Trudeau did here with the unvaccinated, right? Because that was constantly about dividing Canadians, creating an us versus them. The seduction goes even deeper. Enemies give us a profound sense of purpose. New York Times war correspondent Chris Hedges captured that idea perfectly in the title of his brilliant 2002 book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. Tragically, it's true. And that's something that we even explored in a previous deep dive, right? Where we explored the idea of could you create a system parallel to war that creates that sort of meaning and willingness to sacrifice? And I wish it wasn't the case, but enemies do give us truly a profound sense of purpose, right? There's a meme I regularly see that's like, men only have two dreams. One is like raising a family, living off grid, doing this other, and the other one is, the Spartan 300, the dying on the hill, right? The like fighting an impossible fight and somehow winning. And it's only through the idea of others and enemies that we're able to have that level of like conviction and that sort like draw that sense of meaning from a life that otherwise oftentimes feels random and chaotic is this idea of the other and the demonization of them. I think, again, as we have conversations about the idea of amnesty, we need to keep that top of mind that we shouldn't immediately leap to demonizing every single person that disagrees with us or made a mistake in the past. And I think a big distinguishing factor there is, are they willing to admit wrong, right? Are they willing to explore the other side of the argument as new facts come out? Because again, if we see radicalization to the extreme of the I'm not calling for this whatsoever, but you'll see it called for on social media of like hang all the politicians and health officials and stuff like that. That's the same sort of us versus them mentality that creates tyranny and creates mass atrocities that we don't want to see actually occur. Um, Further on, how can we interpret that dynamic? As long as we continue to fall back on the us versus them paradigm, we will remain highly susceptible to manipulation. Labels are still useful, of course. We cannot and should not eliminate them, but we can recognize them for what they are. in the current political climate, we might consider looking beyond the labels and beginning to engage each other as flesh and blood human beings. And again, it's so important, in my opinion, that you always keep that top of mind, right? That person that you're arguing with, that person that maybe you see as the enemy, they still have friends and family that love them, right? Like they still have things they care about and passions and hopefully a purpose outside of the argument that you find yourself in. Now, a couple key points here that I thought were great that was made by the Brownstone Institute. And again, encourage you guys to read this cover to cover. So where do we go from here? For starters, I'll suggest these 4 guidelines that might help us to move in the right direction. Be aware of the polarization dynamic. So again, I think literally just being cognizant of it as you experience it is useful because you can understand this label is a mental shortcut. It provides certain a tool to a certain extent, but like any tool, it can be used to my betterment or detriment. Stop with the name calling. So again, ad hominem attacks, essentially just like name calling, that allows you to other the other side, and it's much easier for you to demonize them when you start to make, it's like the unvaccinated, right? Again, rather just be individuals that are vaccine hesitant, just doesn't have the same ring, right? Like it doesn't work in the same sort of manner where you can easily demonize that individual. Look for the humanity in other people. And then finally, be willing to risk failure. And so the idea here around being willing to risk failure is like, be willing to extend the olive branch, be willing to have these conversations. And that maybe means sometimes you'll fail, right? It maybe means sometimes the person will lash out at you, right? Or they'll make you regret extending that olive branch. But if you're never willing to do it, I think that we're doomed to constantly repeat the cycles of history that we've lived up until this point in time. So anyways, those are the stories I wanted to share with you guys. Love to get your thoughts, your opinions. Jump in the comments section. We really do want to make this a two-way conversation. But anything else, Adam, that you want to share?
No, I think that pretty much covers it, Matt. And yeah, I'm excited to get back to sort of our regular programming here while we're, I've obviously been moving and stuff. So we're going to get back to doing the second half of the show as soon as possible.
Yeah, and we'll keep you posted in the Telegram chat and on social media if we decide to do a night broadcast here. But that's definitely something that we'll consider. We'll just have to figure out the logistics there. But again, appreciate you guys. If you haven't subbed to the Telegram chat, please do so. If you haven't subbed to the Substack articles, again, next week for sure, we'll get back on the horse and regularly producing what I like to think of as excellent Substack articles for you guys to consume. If you haven't checked out my most recent video on everything around the Freedom Convoy and the false narratives, go check it out. Honking Ridiculous, a Trudeau story. I'm also just really proud of that title. But that's it.
I'm a huge fan of that title too, by the way.
Yeah, I just felt perfect because it didn't feel like too aggressive towards Trudeau, but also says everything that I want to say, which is it was fucking ridiculous that we found ourselves in those circumstances in the first place. I think that it all could have been avoided had Trudeau had a little bit less hubris, had he been willing to not demonize his enemies quite as much, right? Again, you can disagree with people without being disagreeable. And I don't think that it needed the sort of divisive language that we saw throughout the 2021 election and going into the additional mandates in 2022. And I think our country's poorer for it, regardless of your political perspective. But I am glad that Canadians were willing to speak out and stand up for what they thought was right.
Yeah. The are we going to tolerate these people comment really smashed me.
So great. But again, all the comments about like, you won't have to wonder if an unvaccinated person sitting across the aisle from you, like, take out the word unvaccinated and put in a different word. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, like this is scary.
Literally any other word. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
But anyways, we'll see you guys tomorrow. Same time, same place. Wednesday, noon Eastern Standard Time. Thanks, guys.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by tried to live your best